Myself and our organization. My name is Mike Ghia, and I'm the Vermont Field Agent for Land for Good. Land for Good is a nonprofit that works in all 6 New England states on farmland access, farmland tenure, and farm transfers and succession. We work in a variety of ways. We work one-on-one with people, and I'll be describing some of our one-on-one services. We work with people through various programs that I'm going to describe today. We provide webinars and in-person programming such as this. We put together written resources, some of which we'll be sharing today. We do some work on policy as well, and we work with various other organizations in all our work. We work with farm seekers. We work with property owners who are non-farmers who are making their land available to farming. And then we work with farm families on succession, and transfer. I've been working on farm transfer and succession with farms throughout New England and a few other parts of the country as well for 17 years. And a lot of the work that I do is through the Vermont Farm and Forest Viability Program, which is funded by the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, which is one of our primary funders for this webinar today. And I will be talking more about that program, as well as some of the other programs that are available in some of the other states. This will be oriented primarily to people in the 6 New England states. I have not actually looked at the roster this year, but in the past we've had 20, 24, 28 different states represented in terms of people who participated in this. So I can't always answer questions completely on services and so forth outside of New England or maybe the Northeast. I can provide some assistance there. As Kali said, please do keep muted during the presentation, but feel free to put questions in the chat as they come up. Kali will draw my attention to them as as it seems relevant, and it'll definitely be 15, 20, 25 minutes at the end for questions, and people could still continue to put them in the chat at that point, or we'll invite people to open up their microphones at that point. And along the way too, I may ask people some follow-up questions, so we can ask you to open up your microphones then. But in the meanwhile, if you could just please keep it muted. So what are we talking about today? What do we call this? We sometimes fumble around these words because they can mean different things, different people, and be kind of charged in terms of how people think about them. Some people don't like the word transfer because they're not ready to actually transfer anything. They're have some emotional feeling about that. But very often, and that's what we will be getting to, about how you transfer different assets and different aspects of the business to people. Succession gets more at thinking about how do we bring on another generation that is ready to be the successors, ready to be that next generation in both financial and skills and in many different aspects, so that they're actually ready. A lot of this presentation is really going to be focused on farms with active businesses that they may want to transfer, and not just real estate, but of course we will be talking about real estate transfers. And then transition. For some people, they just like to think about it as a transition in their life. This slide can be a little bit hard to read on some screens, but this is what we call our bubble diagram here at Land for Good. It basically describes a lot of the things that we're going to cover over the next 4 weeks. And there was a miss there. I meant to just go over, today we're going to be talking about the general overview of farm transfer and the farm transfer process, the resources that are available out there to help people in the 6 New England states, and some examples. And next week, we will have Daphne Moritz, who is an attorney who will be speaking primarily about estate planning and the use of business entities to transfer assets from one generation to the other, as well as some other legal issues. The third week, I will be spending about half an hour of that talking about retirement planning and having it oriented not just to the older generation, but towards the younger generation as well, because it's much easier to plan for retirement if you start earlier. But we'll be talking to both generations on that. But the remainder of that hour and a half, we're going to be talking about, we're going to have Nick Bullock, who is an accountant for Farm Credit East, who's going to come in and talk about tax issues in farm transfer. And then the last webinar, I really hope all of you plan to attend live if you can. These are all being recorded, as you can see, and they will be available online. And so that's, often, what works for people. But the last one is a farmer panel, and it's really the most fun part of this series, to just be hearing farmer stories and their interactions. And we really do encourage people to tell their own stories if they want, and to have some sort of a dialogue, because it's really a good way to learn from people besides all of us technical service providers, to learn from farmers about what they've actually done themselves. So getting back to this bubble diagram here, there's many different aspects to farm transfers, and we're going to touch on all of these today, and then some, and then get into the weeds and get into some more details on the legal and tax side of it, retirement side of it, going later on. But if you can't read this exactly, we've got goal setting and family communication, business planning, land use planning, retirement planning, estate planning, management transfer, asset transfer. All these can, particularly if there's a business involved, all of these can come together. All these are elements that need to be addressed in the farm transfer planning process. And this is purposely not a flow chart, because it is not a linear process. You are going to work on some of these at the same time, and you're going to go back and forth. Some of these things are going to inform each other, who the business is transferring to and how it's going to be transferred is going to inform the estate plan. Tax issues may dictate the timetable, or how you address the financial piece of the transfer. The business plan will definitely have an interaction with a lot of these different things. So it's never going to be exactly a linear process. You're going to go back and forth. And when we start working in depth with people on actually implementing some of these things, or even just in the planning stage, we might go to the lawyer, and the lawyer will make a recommendation, and then we go talk to the accountant and say, but there's this issue that you might consider. And then we go back to back to considering things, and we're considering things with the lawyer again, and it may go back and forth. And sometimes we have team meetings together because these things interact. Transfers can be simple, but they are often complicated, and there might be just a little bit of complications along the way, and some pieces that are difficult for people to figure out. But for some farm families, it can be very complicated. And so for each family, it's a different process. I've been doing this for 17 years. I tell people, if it was always simple, there would be a job for myself and the others, because there's usually some need for people to get some assistance on working through some of the more complicated pieces. The timeline ends up being different. People will come sometimes and they're ready to go. And so a lot of times, if they come to people like myself, they maybe have already been doing a lot of the groundwork themselves without a consultant, or maybe they've consulted their lawyer, and they're just ready to put a few pieces together and make things happen. And farms can always just be transferred fairly easily. If you have an auction and then a real estate agent, you can make things happen. But that's not always what people want in terms of their goals for the farm and their legacy. So if there's something that you want to be more thoughtful, well, not to say that that's an unthoughtful way of going about it, but sometimes people need to be thinking about things such as continuing an existing business that will mean that it's going to take a different amount of time. The worst case scenarios, though, are when people feel forced to make quick decisions, and it could be where our backs are against the wall. Financially, we don't have a successor in line, and so we're going to have that auction tomorrow. We're going to have that sale tomorrow. Or people wait to do something on the transferred succession because of a major event, such as a stroke or a heart attack. The worst, well, I don't say the worst exactly, but one of the most challenging situations that worked with about a decade ago was that someone had terminal cancer. They had 3 months to live, and the son was coming back to the farm after being away from it, didn't really know everything about the farm that he needed to know. And so we basically, fortunately, we ended up having about 5 months of being able to work with the senior farmer on trying to transfer that information and think about updating estate plans and so forth so that the transfer could happen. But of course, it was a much more stressful situation to work under than if people had thought about this much earlier. We like to say that people should be thinking about this at least 5 to 10 years before they think they might want to step out. Even if you don't know for sure that you want to step out, you want to sell, having that thought process going at least 5 to 10 years before you think it's probably a reasonable age that you might want to retire or step out or step back. And so because these things can be complicated, the timeline is often glacial, as one attorney, Annette Higby here in Vermont, used to say, because there can be different pieces that'll take time to work through, or you may have a successor in your family that ends up leaving, or you may be looking for a successor, and that takes time and time to vet them and make sure they're the right person. Working through some of the complicated legal things, it can take more time than you think. One of the farmers that we'll have on the panelist, it's not that they didn't make progress along the way; they made significant progress that we'll define in detail. But I worked with them over the course of 13 years, from the time that they were thinking about retiring and stepping out of the farm until that the employee who was actually in that initial photo there at the beginning slide fully bought them out. Now, there were many steps along the way that I won't go into now, but that led in that direction. But it was a 13-year process before they were fully retired and the farmer, the successor farmer, fully took over. So I tell you, it's not necessarily an event; it's a process. And not thinking that, again, you can have it like we're going to sell everything tomorrow, and then that has a process to it. But usually it's not just thinking, oh, this transfer is just like when we sell the real estate. This workshop is only going to scratch the surface. Even the whole series really just scratches the surface. And one of the things that we've seen over the decades, actually, of doing these kind of workshops, us and others around the country, is that we'll ask people later on, or even a year later, we've done some polling, was the workshop that you attended, was it useful? And people always say, oh yeah, definitely. And then we ask them, did you do anything about it in the interim, months or year? And a very large percentage have not done anything. And so the most important thing that I'll emphasize time and again today is that leave here with some action steps for yourself and think about some concrete steps that you can take to move yourself forward. As I mentioned earlier, we've put together a number of resources, and Kali is going to put a link in the chat, if she hasn't already, for our resource page, which actually doesn't look like this anymore because we just redid our website. But we have a variety of written tools on our website. A couple I'll draw your attention to is we have a workbook that's called the Farm Succession Planning Where Do I Start Guide, which has a bunch of information, but also a bunch of worksheets in it for people to use to get themselves started, to help family discussions get started. We have another publication that's oriented for the junior generation, Farm Succession and Transfer Strategies for the Junior Generation. And that's because a lot of the publications that are out there, and there are from around the country, from Extension and other universities and other organizations, there are other resources, including some that are on our website. A lot of them are really oriented towards the older generation. And so we wrote one a number of years ago that's oriented towards the younger generation. And the last one I'll want to bring your attention to now is that we have a guide called Successful Farm Transfer Planning for Farmers Without Identified Successors. So people that don't know who they want to take over or purchase their farm. And we'll be talking more about working in that scenario today and throughout our program. As far as people advisor, we always say that everyone needs a team. You're going to end up working with a group of different advisors depending on your scenario. You may end up working with transfers advisors like myself, or other people in the Vermont Farm and Forest Viability Program, or my colleagues such as Collie, who introduced this workshop today. Collie is our New Hampshire field agent, and we have people working in all 6 New England states here on our staff. You could be working with business advisors if there's a need, particularly if there's a need to have a new business plan for that next generation. You're going to work with probably more than one attorney. You may work with just one attorney who does it all, but very often it's common to work with more than one attorney. You may have an attorney that works with you just on your estate plan. If you have a business that you're going to transfer through a business entity, most commonly an LLC these days, you might have a different attorney who can work with you on setting up that business agreement. And if you're bringing on new partners as a part of that, which is typically why you'd be creating that entity, that attorney that you bring in to start the LLC will say that it's a conflict of interest for them to work with the younger generation as well, and the younger generation should really have their own attorneys to advise them. And then you may have a real estate attorney in a real estate sale. Now, again, there are some attorneys can do all of those things, or at least 2 of them, but it's not uncommon to have multiple attorneys. We do provide attorney referrals. Of course, we're going to have an attorney in next week, and we will talk more about working with attorneys as well. And then there is also the legal food hub, which exists in all 6 New England states, where you can get attorney referrals. And in some cases, if you qualify, you can get assistance from the attorney on their fees. It's very common for us to work with an accountant on the tax issues. Some people have someone who just does their taxes and really isn't up to the task of thinking about a transfer, particularly if it's a more complicated transfer with business components as well as real estate components that may be not so straightforward as well, because there's that mixture of houses and businesses and so forth. Lenders are often at the table particularly when we're talking about a farm with a farm business. But of course, if somebody is needing just even to buy the real estate, a lender is going to have to be involved. But if we're talking about creating a business entity and going from a sole proprietorship to an LLC, and there's loans on that business, on the assets that are in that business, or that you're going to put into that business, then the lender is going to have to approve the creation of that entity. If you're bringing on the new members, the lender is going to have to be at the table saying, we're comfortable with those new parties coming on. Insurance agents will often play a role, particularly in life insurance. Life insurance can get used to buy out someone's equity when they die, or to clear off debt, to provide money for non-farming heirs. Appraisers may come into the picture when you're trying to determine the value of the real estate, or trying to determine the value of the business, and what's the value of the cattle and equipment. So sometimes we'll be bringing in 2 different types of appraisers. Facilitators and counselors. Sometimes these discussions, as we'll talk about more, some of these discussions get to be difficult for families, at the very least, if not contentious. And so sometimes it's necessary to bring in other people who have those skills to kind of help families have productive and healthy discussions. We'll talk a little bit more about those in this discussion here. So at Land for Good, we provide one-on-one initial consultations, short initial consultations of 2 to 3 hours over Zoom, sometimes in person if we happen to be nearby, but typically by Zoom. We can provide up to 2 to 3 hours of free consultation to any farm family in New England. And then we are also a contractor to the Vermont Farm and Forest Viability Program, and I'll expand on that in a minute. In some states, there are extension agents that also do specialize in helping farm families with farm succession and transfer. Farm Credit East has consultants on their staff to do farm transfer and succession. In every state in New England and most of the states in the country, there are agricultural mediation programs which are funded by USDA, and they can help farm families on having farm transfer and succession discussions in general, and then particularly when there is things that are become contentious, but not even, it doesn't have to be that it's gotten contentious. They are willing to come in and facilitate discussions with farm families that just want to have a facilitator involved and otherwise may or may not be involved with farm viability or one of the extension programs, just to have another person to help facilitate conversations. In Vermont, we have a program called Farm First. Farm First works on stress and mental health. They provide counseling services. And so in some cases, when family dynamics are particularly challenging or there are mental health issues that are interfering with discussions, or just the need for family counseling that goes beyond just having a mediator or a facilitator, but a real need to get at some additional needs of the family, Farm First can be involved. Unfortunately, we are the only state that I know of that has that precisely. Now, I know New Hampshire has just relaunched its New Hampshire Strong program, which is going to provide many of those same services. I can't speak to other states. I know that there's been efforts in some other states, but the one I'm most familiar with is Farm First. If anybody knows of other programs similar to Farm First in other states, please put them in the chat. I already mentioned when talking about our farmer panel that other farmers are a really great resource for figuring out how to go about farm transfers. We've had occasionally farmer discussion groups get together just to talk about succession, and we know that farmers are talking to other farmers about what's been useful and helpful, as well as what are the pitfalls and challenges in transfer and succession. I've already mentioned that in Vermont, we have the Farm Viability Program that Land for Good is a contractor to. Massachusetts also has a Farm Viability Program that doesn't offer as yet. They're working on offering more robust services, but right now they don't offer the same level of services that Vermont does, which is a program that I'm going to expand on in a minute. But they do provide funding to certain farms for farm transfer and succession. New Hampshire doesn't exactly have a viability program, but we've been piecing together some different sources of funding. And we always try in all the New England states to try to find some funding source, including I know we have a little bit of funding now in Connecticut to work with people on farm transfer and succession, which is part of why the Connecticut Department of Agriculture is also a sponsor of this workshop. And so we try to work with whatever programs we can to help get funding to help farmers with getting the services that they need to help them move things along. So just a little bit more detail about the Vermont Farm and Forest Viability Program. For those of you out there who are in Vermont, the program is a 2-year program initially, though we do have funds to do more short-term consultations after that. As I mentioned, one of the farms that's going to be on the panel, the one that panel on the 4th week, that was featured on the initial photo. I worked with them over 13 years, and that time was all funded through the Vermont Farm and Forest Viability Program. But the first 2 years are where we do the most intensive work with people on the planning and hopefully getting them moving forward as well. It's a $70 fee, and you get the services of someone like myself over the course of 2 years, and that we are a contractor, as well as UVM Extension, the Center for Agricultural Economy in Hardwick, the Intervale Center out of Burlington, and NOFA Vermont, the Organic Farming Association. So all of those organizations are contractors to the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board Farm and Forest Viability Program. We all provide basically the same services. Sometimes we actually work together on certain farms, and Most of us are also providing additional seed money to help with a little bit of cost share to offset the cost of, say, an attorney or appraiser or accountant. It's only a small pool of money, but it does help. Is there any questions out there, Collie?
Nope, not yet.
Okay. So as I said a few minutes ago, the most important thing is just getting started. The biggest challenge I see in farm transfer planning is inertia. Is people are just keep going forward doing what they've been doing as if nothing is going to ever change in terms of their position in the business or their ownership in the business, or the younger generation's position in the business, or they're thinking about it, but there's always something to be done in the barn. There's always something to be done out in the field. So we don't have time to think about this. This is not the most forefront thing on their mind, particularly if you're working with financial uncertainty, if there's family dynamics to be worked out, you're just like, it's easier to just not deal with it. So we'll get to it someday. And unfortunately, as I said, sometimes it's a crisis, it's cancer, it's a stroke, it's a heart attack. And that's the worst case scenario to be thinking about this, to be working on it. The other thing that I see is a main driver on people's failure to launch is that it seems too complicated and people feel overwhelmed. And so they just say, I can't figure out how to even get started with this, which of course is what we're trying to do here today and with some of the work that we do. I tell people it's like eating an elephant. And I know that's a cliche, but you're not eating an elephant one bite at a time. And I think sometimes the best service that someone like myself can do is just helping people figure out what part of the elephant to take a bite of and how big a chunk to take so people don't choke on it and then say, I'm done with that. And so, when getting started, the most important thing is just take a bite. Don't worry if it's the right bite, it's the right part of the elephant. Just start something. And as I said, when you come at it today, I think what you want to think about is what are some action steps that you can do to either get yourself started or get yourself restarted, because it's not uncommon for families to start things and make some progress. And then again, summer hits, they're out in the field, nobody's thinking about it, nobody's talking about it, or something disrupts them. Like, of course, rain and floods this year. I'll give you, example later on of one that got disrupted that way. And so then it's a matter of restarting. So if you're here today and you're trying to restart or move things along that's been stuck, just start thinking about a few concrete steps. Don't worry if they're the right ones or the most extensive ones. Just start making some progress. Keep it on the agenda, and particularly if you're even just talking as a couple, if you're a couple that owns the property, but certainly if you have other family members or employees that you're looking to be partners in it, you want to make time for this. It's much better to actually schedule some meetings, which is an anathema for a lot of farmers. A lot of farmers get into farming to have meetings. But you're running a business and you're in a business now that's involving multiple people, and it's not always your spouse. And even there, your spouse, you still may not take the time, or the people it might not be the right time for people to talk. The scenario I've heard more than once is somebody who's working out in the field, and then somebody, their father or mother comes out and says, well, do you want this farm or not? It's not the right time to have that conversation. Far better for you to actually set time aside where people know this is what we're coming in to talk about, coming in prepared, coming in thoughtful, and taking the time to say, we know there's a lot more to be done out there. We're going to focus in on this now and try to have productive conversations. Otherwise, people get tense and anxious, and they are not going to be as thoughtful, or they might get more on the defensive about things, even things that you're actually kind of in agreement with. It's just that feeling uncomfortable about all of a sudden getting put on the spot or feeling like they should be somewhere else. The main people that you want to have involved are, if you've identified them, potential successors, and they may not be family. The example I keep coming back to at the beginning, Phil was not family. He was a longtime employee. But you do want to eventually also talk to other family members who are maybe not involved with the farm. Now, ultimately, the people that really should have the most say in the process and going forward are the people that are going to stay with the farm. But it's important for at least the other family members to be made aware of those discussions, because otherwise there could be hurt feelings later, or disputes over wills because they didn't know what mom and dad planned. And it's good to have those discussions so that everybody can get out, at least hear each other out, if not get on the same page. And then one of the key things you can do, if you haven't, is starting to think about who the advisors are that you want to bring onto your team. When we sit down with farm families, and particularly those that have a business, so this is mainly oriented to those that have a business. One of the things that becomes important to kind of suss out for the family, because they may not even know themselves, and it may differ amongst family members, is which side of this chart are you on, or which do you tend towards? Are you more family system oriented, where the most important thing is that the family's all in agreement, the family is all involved, that the farm stays in the family? Or are you looking at it more like a business? The most important thing is to be thinking about, we have this business here, we want it to continue. We're gonna, some families, they'll have business meetings where they say, we're leaving the family stuff at the door. We are not going to we're going to try to keep as much of the family conversations out. And when we're sitting around the Thanksgiving table, we're not talking about business. We're trying to keep them compartmentalized as much as we can. And we're also making decisions like who's involved in the same way any other business would, because just because they're family members doesn't necessarily mean they're the best people to do certain jobs or to even be a part of owner of the business. And so knowing about yourself, how you approach this is important, and having an awareness of how the group is approaching this is important. And there's always going to be some level of a balance there, because it is, if we're talking about family businesses or even just close relationships in terms of partners, you have to think about how you're approaching this towards thinking about how you're going to have these conversations and what's going to drive you going forward. When we start to look at some of the issues that you have to address, we'll sometimes divide these between hard issues on the left here, soft issues on the right. The hard issues are more about the mechanics of how the transfer happens or how things are structured, as far as the business side, the legal documents, the tax issues you have to address, getting the written estate plans, the retirement plans, and the actual money involved. And then management, who's controlling what's going on in the business, who's controlling the property, who's on that piece of paper that says that they're in charge, or sharing being in charge. The soft issues are the family communication side that I've been talking about, and how well people actually communicate with each other. The vision, do people have different visions? Are their visions clear or unclear? Are there some people that have very clear visions of what they want, and other people have unclear visions? Conflicting personal goals or unclear goals can be a big part of the discussion for families, because there may be people, for instance, that want to keep doing the same kind of business that they're already doing, want it to stay a dairy farm, and somebody else wants it to be something else. And that can cause conflict in the families. I've already kind of talked about management abilities, and the potential that there may be people who have different management abilities and skills. They may be able to work their way up to what's needed for the business, they may not, and they may just not have that motivation or drive to be an entrepreneur. It's not uncommon. I've worked with farm families where one person wants to be the owner and the other really just wants to be the employee. They want to get a check and they want to go back because their quality of life is based around working a 40-hour week and not working the kind of week that a business owner might work with. Fair versus equal is a discussion that we very frequently have because it's in the past and even now, it was not uncommon for a lot of parents with multiple children to say, I want to treat all my kids equally. Which is really, as a father myself, I know is really kind of a myth. You really can't treat everybody equally. And particularly when it comes to a farm, in the past, and again, I still see this, people will say, well, we're going to leave the farm to all our children. And they say, well, we got 4 children, we're going to leave them all of them. But only one of them stayed at the farm. Only one of them is putting in the work day to day to keep the farm a farm. Is that fair? And the ultimate question can be, what is the fair way to treat non-farming heirs and not necessarily treat them equally with the person who's staying with the farm, who may be sacrificing income very, very significantly, and is maybe sacrificing their time because they're putting in 60 or 70-hour weeks. Should they actually have to share the farm equally with their siblings who aren't working on the farm, who may have moved away and have nice high-tech jobs? Does that make sense? And those discussions can be very, very challenging because there's a lot of emotion involved for the parents and the children. But it's things that need to get worked through in a way that's actually going to allow the farm to keep going, because too often a lot of the farms where the farms are left equally to everyone, and then somebody decides that they want their equity, their share out of it, and they force a sale or a buyout that the farm cannot afford, and then the farm actually leaves the family, which was never the goal for the older generation to begin with. On the positive side, a lot of people think about their legacy. They've built up a business, they've built up something that they can be proud of, or they've just stored the land for another generation that might be the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th generation that it's been in the family, and they want to carry out that legacy. And there's a lot of emotion about that, including if there are not family members who want to continue the farm, thinking about it maybe leaving the farm, but perhaps if done well in the right circumstances, passed along where the legacy of farming continues to another generation that's outside the family. And so that people can still drive by and be very proud of the fact that their farm continues for another generation. I worked on a transfer last year where this farm had been a vegetable farm for decades under one family. And then when they got ready to retire, they had no children that wanted to take it over. And so they found a young farmer who they sold it to, who built up and really expanded the business and did very well with it. Person not much older than me, in his 50s, who unfortunately, after being there for 20 years, was in his 50s and unfortunately got pancreatic cancer. And he died very young, in his mid 50s. And so his widow knew she couldn't carry on the farm. And so she put up the farm for sale, worked with us, worked with the Vermont Land Trust, and we found another farmer who's taken over that farm. And the original farmer that I mentioned is now, well, one of them is still alive, and she lives down the road, and she can still see that the legacy of the farm, even though it didn't stay in her family, it didn't even stay in the family that she and her husband sold it to, has the legacy is that it's still a farm, and it's still a farm where a young family are raising their children and providing produce to their community. And so that legacy is important to them. And so thinking about what you want to see in your legacy for your farm, and how pliable that is important, but can be a very positive thing in this process. It becomes positive to kind of counteract some of the other things that can be difficult for people, like retiring from the farm and giving up your identity as a farmer, or feeling like you're giving up your identity as a farmer, even if you may be working on the farm, but it's not yours anymore. So that can be really challenging. And thinking about thinking about retirement is a very, very challenging thing for farmers. A lot of them think they're gonna die on the tractor, and the reality of it is that many of them will not. Even if they even if they wanted to, they may physically not be able to at some point. And you don't necessarily want to wait until that point where the farm may have deteriorated or the farm business may have not been as strong as it was when you're at a different age. And so those things can be very difficult for people to work through. And then you can see I have management control on this side of the equation as well, because that is one of the biggest challenges that we have in transferring a business where the previous owner stays on in the business. Is they're used to making decisions solely by themselves, and now they're going to have to share decisions, or they're giving up decisions, particularly if maybe they've sold the business completely to the next generation, but they're staying on as an employee, where very often their input is very much appreciated. If somebody's cared for a farm for decades, usually that younger generation wants to keep getting advice from the older generation, but it's still not the same as when maybe they get that advice and make a different decision. And so, we'll run into difficulties with this where, I worked with one vegetable farm that brought on two partners and had made they had made decisions on who was going to be in control of certain things, and certain aspects, and you're going to be working out in these fields on certain days. And too often the younger farmers were coming out into the field and seeing the employees doing something differently than they had told the employees to do. And they said, well, the original owner, he came out and he told us to do something different. So he was constantly undermining the people he was supposedly giving management control to. And it really was causing a big source of tension, because he said he wanted to give management control. And honestly, I know that he really and sincerely did, but he just couldn't help seeing things done differently than he would have had them done. And then he felt like it was wrong and it was going to cause financial losses, and he needed to step in, because if he didn't, there was going to be problems, and he couldn't see that maybe it could be done a different way a lot of the time. And just earlier this week, I was talking to a son of whose 82-year-old father still controls all the management decisions, even though he keeps telling his son, I know I have to let you make these decisions. And they have some very big decisions on rebuilding a barn that burned down 2 years ago. And they haven't rebuilt it, in part because they can't get on the same page, because the father can't see that the son needs to have the barn built away for the next 30 years for himself. And the father's looking at how he would build the barn. And it's really made parts of this transfer very, very difficult. Do we have any questions out there?
No questions yet, but feel free, everyone, if you do have questions that come up, please put them in the chat and I'll keep an eye on it as we go forward.
So when you're getting started, one of the things to do is to have conversations, whether it's on your own or facilitate conversations with people like myself or other service providers, about what your goals are going forward. And that can take time, as I've already said. It can take time for people to think about their goals going forward, especially if it's going to be a big shift for people in the older generation from what they're doing. They know they have to reset their goals with a different mindset than they've been looking at things before. And both generations need to be able to freely share their goals and visions with each other. One of the biggest challenges can be when the two generations have different points of view, and people are afraid to say that, to speak up and say it, or they're afraid of it because they've had pushback or people have gotten on the defensive before. And that's again where ourselves or a mediator can sometimes come in and help facilitate those conversations. But there has to be a free dialogue back and forth, even if people are talking about things that they don't necessarily agree with. And so both generations definitely need to work through their differences as these kind of issues come up. As I said earlier, it's good to involve non-farming family members, but you know, the people who are running and storing the farm need to be the priority in the decision making. I have seen sometimes where the non-farming siblings or non-farming spouses sometimes come in and because they don't have as much emotion in the discussions, they can sometimes help actually with some of the facilitation and having people maybe take a step back from some of the dynamics. Years ago, I took a class on or a 3-day training on farm succession and transfer out at the University of Wisconsin, and there were people from all over the country and Canada that were there for this training. And the people from Iowa and Nebraska, they both had a approach that they would not meet with families around the kitchen table because dad always sits where dad has always sat, mom always sits where mom has always sat. The children sit where they've always sat since they were in high chairs. And in their opinion, you couldn't break up the dynamic of that kind of control and power differentiation if everybody just sat in the same places that they've always sat. They wanted to get people into an extension office or a farm credit office or an FSA office, somewhere that was more of a business like setting, and getting them into a conference room where the dynamic could be changed. Now, I don't personally practice that. Most of the people that work here in the New England generally don't practice that. But I have noted it several times to people as we've sat around the table that this is what I can see what's happening here, and to ask them to think through about how do we change that dynamic. And there have been a few cases where I said, you know what, I think we need to go meet in a more neutral area. Or sometimes the family members have said to me, we need to meet in a more neutral family area, and ask me to find a room for us to meet in. You know, as I gave emphasis, I'll just give it again, you know, planning meetings to focus on the issue, consider the time and the location so that it's going to be the right environment, and bring in ag mediation or farm first as necessary. It's, you know, for some people there, you know, there's a sign that, well, I think there's two issues that come up. One is that some people think these issues are so private, I can't speak in front of other people about these issues. We really don't want somebody from the outside, and that could be a real impediment, because sometimes you really just need that, and just recognize that, you know, there are professionals out there that have the skills to help with that, and we're all working on confidentiality requirements. Nothing is going to go somewhere else. Whether you're working with us, you're working with a mediator, you're working with counselors through Farm First or another similar organization, it's not going to go anywhere. And people also just feel too sometimes like it's a sign of a failure, and it's not. It's really common. It is so very common for families to have difficulty communicating on this. Is why I give so much emphasis to it, why there's these programs that exist. You're not alone, and there really is. Take advantage of the benefits of this and not look at it as being a negative, because very often people come out on the other side much better than when they went in. One of the first transfers that I worked with 17 years ago, I could see the tension between the father and the son, and eventually I started having to meet with the father and the son and the daughter-in-law separately, and go back and forth between them. And I kept trying to get them to work with ag mediation. It wasn't until after the transfer was complete that the father went to ag mediation, because he realized now that like the whole business thing that was kind of interfering with their personal relationship had been settled, that what he wanted was to have a good relationship with his son. And so he used mediation afterwards. I would have liked to use it along the way. It might have, you know, stopped some hurt feelings. But in the end, it actually came in handy, where they were able to repair a lot of the damage in the relationship that came from the tension over the business aspects of the farm. So some of the common concerns that we'll be working up against, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on, is you know, financial viability. Is there a viable business now? Is it profitable? Can it support 2 families if you're going to bring on partners, or 2 or 3 or 4 families? Often that's not the case. Often the farm businesses aren't capable of they may not really be truly profitable for the senior generation. or they're profitable for the senior generation because of the level of debt that the senior generation is at. But when if the younger generation needs to buy out the younger generation as a part of the retirement plan for the older generation, then adding that debt level often is where a farm that might be working and be profitable for the older generation all of a sudden is not going to be profitable for the younger generation. And so we have to work through those things. And if there's more than one person who wants to come back to the farm, if it's more than one family members, or it's not unheard of for to be a family member and an employee partnering together, is the business big enough? How much debt is the farm carrying? I always expect farms to be carrying some level of debt. It's a question of whether it's a reasonable amount of debt. And particularly as people are getting towards retirement, the having a reasonable amount, which is something I can't in this webinar get into specifically because it's going to really depend on each situation, becomes important both from the standpoint that if there's going to be a buyout by the younger generation, that once the first thing you have to do is pay that debt, and anything that's going to be left over for your retirement is going to be what's above what's your equity above that debt. So if your debt level's too high, it's not necessarily going to fund retirement just to sell out your assets. And if it's too high, it also reduces the chances of using gifting or bargain sales or other tools to try to keep the cost down for that younger generation, because you're just going to have too much debt to carry that off. Funding for retirement and healthcare, if people are going to retire, becomes a major concern. Or even if you don't think that you're going to retire, and this is one of the issues that we come into, people didn't think for 30 years that they were going to retire until they got to be 65 or 70, and some issues came up, hips and knees. I've worked with so many farmers that have had hips and knees replaced. Now some are able to come right back from that and jump right back into the farm, and others are just like, it just made me realize I want to take a step back. I want to step out, and they may not fully retire, but they'll partially retire. And we're going to talk more about that in detail in the third session. But if they haven't planned for that retirement with some additional savings, and all they have is Social Security and farm assets, it can make it more complicated in the transfer. And one of the things that we'll talk about next week, as well as the following week, is about long-term health care, because that has probably become the biggest concern that people come to us with now is I don't want nursing home to get the farm. Well, the nursing home doesn't want your farm, they want to get paid. And so we'll talk more about that next week. Whether it's children, I have children in here, whether it's children or an employee or a young new farmer that's got all kinds of management skills, but no money. One of the biggest concerns that comes up is how to help that younger generation build equity so that they're part owners and they have the ability to potentially buy out the older generation or finance loans to grow the business the way they want it to grow. And we spend a lot of time helping people try to figure that out. I've already talked a lot about fair treatment of off-farm heirs, and that's certainly something we can have more discussion on. Taxes comes up a lot. People are less concerned about estate taxes these days because most people are not don't have a $11.7 million estate, or if you're a couple of $22 million estate for the federal estate tax. But there are states with estate taxes that people have to be considering estate taxes for. But for most people, the concern is when they go to sell assets and capital gains taxes. And so we will be featuring that in the third webinar when we bring Nick Bullock in from Farm Credit East to talk through those tax issues. I tell people it's important to not let any one of these issues dominate the discussion and prevent you from planning or taking action because you don't know, how to address any one of these, or you haven't got a full picture on one of these, so you're not doing anything, or you're not working on the other pieces that you could still be working on, even if this one other major piece still might have to be figured out. this comic in here because I do see a lot of people obsessing about taxes, and there's, you know, the cliche, I'm sure there's only two certainties in life, death and taxes. And when we get to succession, we really, as succession and transfer planning, we realize people don't want to pay taxes. Nobody wants to pay taxes. And so we're always trying to help people think through with their advisor, tax advisors, how do we mitigate or minimize it? But I have worked with a number of farmers who are kind of bending over backwards because they don't want to pay taxes in this process, and so it's interfering with the transfer because they're really letting the taxes guide how the transfer is going to get structured, and not how things like what's going to be the best interest and the most affordable for the younger generation, what's going to provide the most flexibility, and really what they had to take a step back and said, look, I'm going to pay taxes. We're going to try to mitigate and minimize them so that we don't have to pay very much, but we're still probably going to have to pay taxes in this. And so now we have to think about what is the bigger picture. And I'm picking on taxes just because that's one I've just come across more than once with farmers I've worked with, but it could be any one of those other things aspects that I was talking about. I talked a little bit about this a little while ago. So one of the biggest challenges is the farm profitability of it. Too much debt, capital infrastructure improvements. One of the things that's been seen in a bunch of the research out there, and I've seen definitely directly, is that with farm businesses, when people don't have a successor, they tend not to put money back into the business, especially if it allows them to keep some more cash for themselves. And when they have a successor, they do start to think about that kind of investment that they need to put in. One example was a farm I didn't actually work with, but I was on it was actually a vegetable and berry twilight tour where the farmer, they had invested in a wash and pack center, loading docks, cooling. It was several $100,000 to build this building. And the farmer turned to the group and said, I would not have put this kind of money in it at my age if it weren't for the two successors that were now partners in the business, because they were trying to expand the wholesale produce side of the business, and they also were looking at food safety regulations. If you guys don't know that alphabet soup's there, FSMA and GAPS are the food safety regulations for produce, and to keep up with the current regulations is one of the things that people have to reinvest in. In this case, they put in a lot of money because they were also trying to go for the markets that required it. I worked with an orchard once that when I started with him, he had 4 daughters, none of whom were involved. And he said, you know, I don't really, you know, I'm going to leave it to all 4 of them was the initial plan until I got involved. And then through the planning process, there was one daughter who was down in the New Hampshire seacoast and moved back to the Vermont orchard and is now a partner in it, now the business manager for the orchard. And as soon as clear that she was coming back to the farm, he ended up starting to reinvest in the orchard. Like he was putting up 16-foot high deer fence that needed to replace thousands of feet of this deer fence that he wouldn't have done. He said he wouldn't have done it if he didn't know that his daughter's coming back. He's let that for the next guy to worry about. He started replanting parts of the orchard that he was, he could have limped along with the older trees, but now he knew that there was somebody else coming along. I've just seen a number of examples like that where people start to put money back into the farm because they've known that they have a successor where they weren't doing that before. And one of the challenges that we've seen is when the younger generation comes into a farm where there wasn't that kind of reinvestment because there was this delay in thinking about getting another generation in there, and there was too much uncertainty, that the farm needs so much more investment. It becomes very costly for that next generation to make those new investments. Now, in some cases, this won't apply if it's pretty clear that the business that's there is not going to continue. But when there's really a potential for a turnkey business, it is really important that there isn't so much there that has to be reinvested in for that new farmer, or else it's not really a full turnkey operation. Insufficient Social Security and retirement. I'm gonna beat on that drum in 2 weeks more, but basically I see people who either because the farm hasn't been profitable or because they have an accountant that makes sure that their Schedule F never shows a profit, they end up paying little or no self-employment tax and end up coming back with a meager Social Security. And in the meanwhile, they maybe put all the money back into the farm, but not into IRAs or 401ks or off-farm real estate or something like that. And so everything is tied up for their retirement on a meager Social Security and on selling farm assets. And that's where we're going to spend a half an hour, 45 minutes on that in a couple of weeks, because trying to figure out how to do that better can help in the farm transfers. And of course, as I've already said, the younger generation, often you'll have people, the best people that you want are in the business have been people who've been working on farms, usually for, not much pay. And so they're not coming to the table with a bunch of pile of money to buy out and no cash, and they have no cash to put into the business. So that's one of the things that we're working on. How do you build up that equity over time? Sometimes there's a new business plan needed to get back to the farm financial viability part. And sometimes it's an entirely new business. I've worked with a number of dairy farmers over the years whose that business wasn't working anymore. They didn't want to do it. The next generation didn't want to do it. Next generation wanted to do something else. I've worked with other farms that have transitioned as well. It's just the dairy has been one of the more common ones that people have tried to go into a different business entirely. How are we doing on questions? Do we have any questions?
No, not really. We had a couple about different languages, but I think people are good so far.
Okay. So how's this transition usually done? So again, this is oriented towards farms that have an existing business, as opposed to people who are just selling real estate or have real estate to transfer. So it's typically done in stages over multiple years, and that's part about building up that equity for that younger generation. If you think back to the bubble diagram at the beginning, all the different aspects that are going in there. Sometimes I'll simplify it to this here, where we're talking about the first step are about transferring management responsibilities, and including transfer decision-making power, and then the transfer of intermediate business assets, and transfer of real estate often comes last. And the first part gets really missed by a lot of people, is that the younger, often people get to thinking about, how do I transfer the real estate or maybe even the business and the real estate, not thinking about the fact that the younger generation needs management skills first. The most common thing that I see for the younger generation is that they often have very good skills on the production side, but they have not been trained or had exposure to the business side. So thinking about financial management, bookkeeping, hiring and firing of employees, doing payroll, managing cash flow, managing debt, managing loans, planning ahead for infrastructure. And that last one can sometimes become a point of tension, where the younger generation thinks, I want to do this and this and this, and they're not thinking about the risk or the cost. Last week, I was working with a farm in Massachusetts where the son wants to put in a milking robot. Now, he has not had any look at the books, and the father knows and the mother knows that they are not going to be able to afford to put in a robot, especially with a lot of the other parameters that they have. But that's, he hasn't actually looked at the financial aspects. So in our next meeting, that's part of what we're gonna be looking at more in depth on. And so, we'll see that a lot, where the younger generation has all these ideas for things that they can spend money on, and some of them will actually make the business more profitable if done correctly. But on the other side of it, they may not some of those other ones are going to be a lot of cost and not necessarily the return to the business. They may improve certain things, but it won't necessarily pay for itself. And so and that's partly just they don't have the experience with it. And so you need to get them the experience with that kind of management skills. The next thing that I'll see that there's a deficit on that's very important is if it's not a farm that is shipping a commodity, but actually is marketing a product, which is many of the farms that we're working with, they're not involved on the marketing side. They're not involved with wholesale buyers, or they may not be involved so much with the retail side. They don't know the breakdown of the different markets. And so some of the things that we'll do is try to get them exposed to how have the senior generation made decisions about what markets they're pursuing, what markets they're not pursuing, what markets are really profitable for them, how you interact with those different markets. So I worked with a vegetable farmer in the Champlain Valley of Vermont, and I think they might be at least one of them might be on the panel in the last session. But Pauline, the daughter, she had been away for 10 years, working other jobs, and then decided she wanted to come back to the farm. She had worked on the farm, doing the physical aspects of it when she was growing up, but she needed to actually get reoriented a lot of that now that she was going to be running the business. And so she spent, I think it almost was 5 years just working on the farm back as an employee. But part of what we were doing along the way as I was working with them was getting her involved with not just that financial and business side that we were talking about, but they have a lot of wholesale markets. And so in the winter, when they would typically meet with a lot of the produce managers that they were selling to, we made sure that she started going to those meetings. So she started to become the face of the farm so that those produce buyers knew that they were going to be working with Pauline, and Pauline knew who they were and knew what they wanted for quality, what they wanted for quantity, what they wanted for different parts of the year. Those were all things that even if she hadn't left for 10 years, she might still not have been exposed to, because that's a really common thing that I'll see happen. That's not their responsibilities. Ultimately, the true transfer of management comes when they actually have some control of the checkbook. Maybe not the sole control, they may be partners in it, but where they're actually influencing the budgeting for the year, the decisions on capital investments. That doesn't come right away, and it doesn't come easy when people are not sure if the younger generation is ready for it. You have to be moving in that direction, knowing that someday you're not going to be around for whatever reason to make those decisions anymore. And if you want the farm to succeed, you have to make sure that they have those skills before you really start thinking about transferring any of the assets. The next stage that we're usually going into is a transfer of the intermediate assets. So these are the non-real estate assets, intermediate and current assets. So your current assets would be livestock feed, all your hay and corn that's stored. It would be produce that's stored. If you've got carrots and potatoes stored this time of year, it's going to be all your seed, all your fertilizer, all that stuff is all your current assets. And then the intermediate assets would be chattel, would be livestock, equipment. We go back and forth about whether we put high tunnels in as an intermediate asset or semi-fix the real estate where we put that, but we make a decision about what is going to be transferred. And then usually that's put into the business. We give it a value. We make sure that we have a good value for it. Again, that's where appraisers might come into the picture. And then we transfer that business either fully or as a partnership. And the partnership these days is usually through a limited liability company or LLC rather than a general partnership. Those are generally going by the wayside. Occasionally it might be an S corporation or an LLC that's set up taxed as a S corporation. Those are all things that you decide together with your lawyer and your accountant, and usually we're involved some in those discussions as well. But the most typical scenario is that you create an LLC that's filing taxes as a partnership. That's most of the farms I work with that's what they end up doing. Again, we're going to talk about the legal entity side and get into the weeds more about that next week. And the following week, we'll talk about the tax side of it, including electing versus being a partnership versus a S corp, and your taxing in the third session. So whether you're doing it as a partnership and a gradual transfer, or maybe the younger generation is buying those assets for their own business, then there's usually a period of time where they're renting. So during that time, while they're renting or the new business entity is renting, is when that younger generation is often building up equity. And if it's the most direct and straightforward is if they are building up that equity, because they bought out the business and they're either doing seller financing with you, or they're getting a loan from Farm Service Agency or Farm Credit, or Vermont, it could be Vita as well. And, they're building up equity by paying off those loans. But they might be getting equity in the business through sweat equity, or where you're gifting them some of the equity over time in recognition of unpaid compensation. That would be a very common scenario that we would see. Or maybe you have a personal loan with them to buy their shares in the LLC, or they will take some money each year and they will buy some more value in the LLC over time. I've been working with one farm for several years now, where what they did was they created this entity for the vegetable operation. Again, no real estate in the entity. And for 5 years, each year, the senior farmer gifted equity in the LLC as in recognition of basically a form of compensation in addition to their salaries. And a little extra piece to this was that the operating agreement was written with what's called a vesting term, which meant that they couldn't immediately pull out that equity right away. They had to be with the business for so many years before they could pull out that equity they were earning that way. And now they're at a point where the senior generation's at 52% equity in the business, and the younger generation's at 48%. Each partner has 24%. And so what we were moving towards was that this winter, we were looking that the younger generation was going to go out and do a refinancing with Farm Credit and buy out the senior generation of the business. And then we were going to look at starting to include them as part owner in the real estate. Unfortunately, the floods and the rain just really made it the business, and it put the business in a very difficult financial situation right now. So the idea of refinancing for that purpose, for the buyout, unfortunately is going to have to wait at least another year. But this business is a strong business, and I think we're going to get around to it. But anybody that lived through the rain of this year knows why that could have been so disruptive. And then the last transfer can be the real estate. And I think I have a slide on this. So I already went through about the financial skills, business management skills, and the marketing skills being the first step. So to kind of add to what I was talking about, very often if it's a young family, personal family member, even if it's an employee, it's often good for them to actually go off somewhere and get an education first, or work elsewhere first, work for other farms. I worked with one vegetable and fruit farm where the father had immigrated from a farm in France, and he did not want his son to come back to the farm right away. He wanted him to go work for his uncle in France, or he ended up working for farms in Canada because that's where he went to college to study agriculture, to get exposure, to make sure this is the right place for them, as well as learn how other people do things, to learn those skills that they might learn from other people. But just to make sure that they don't feel like they were obligated and tied down to this particular farm, that they could go out and explore the world and make sure that it's the right farm for them. I actually just yesterday gave most of this presentation. Some of you out there might just heard part of this yesterday. for the Vermont New Hampshire Christmas Tree Growers Association. And at lunch, I was talking to one of the growers, young growers, who told me that he worked out in California as an irrigation specialist for larger farms out there for a decade, before coming back to a very remote part of Vermont. And he always knew he wanted to come back, but he also knew that he needed to get out. And I see it's just very common that this day and age, that a lot of young people want to get out and explore things in their 20s. They tend to get married later, say in their 30s, have kids later in their 30s. And at that point, they're often thinking about where do I want to raise my kids? At the very least, all of a sudden, that small little rural town in rural New England or upstate New York or wherever you guys are at, all of a sudden sounds more appealing as a place to raise children. And they might also, and I have seen this, realize, as in the case of Pauline, with Golden Russet Farm, 10 years later, she realized that she wanted to come back to the farm. And I remember her father telling me that they were in a car together. He almost drove off the road when she told him, and because he was so surprised. And it's worked out very well. I also didn't work with, but I know nearby me is an organic dairy farm that one of the sons was an engineer for Hewlett Packard. And he was that for 10 years, and they realized, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to come back and I want to take over the farm. And now he's partners with his brother and the hard man that's worked with them since high school. They're all three-year partners. And I worked with someone who came back to a farm. It was also got an engineering degree, worked as an engineer for quite a while. And he came back to his parents' farm, which was beef and maple, and he planted, which is now a very, very successful apple orchard on it, and is taking over now for the beef and the maple. But they were away for that period, and they didn't necessarily, in these cases, they didn't necessarily study agriculture, but they got out and studied something that was still useful. The engineering still comes useful on a farm for sure. But they explored and figured out that it was the right thing for them to do to come back to the farm. As I've said in a few examples, sometimes the best thing is for them to come back as an employee rather than an owner right away. Make sure it's actually a good fit. Make sure that they're learning those skills before they're actually becoming an owner or a partner. And it might be that one of the intermediary steps is to truly make them in charge of an aspect of the business, that they are a crew manager, that they are in charge of cropping, that they're the herdsman, whatever it is, herdsman or woman, and that they really have some experience having to be that person who makes those decisions going forward, even if they're making it together. Some of the decisions, consulting the team, as I said, sometimes the intermediate assets, when you get to that point of creating a business, sometimes it's going to be a gradual transfer, or it could be a full buyout, depending on what we're looking at, the scenario that we're looking at, whatever works best for everyone. And as I've been, expressing the comments, variation on this is that if they're not doing a buyout, is that they're partnering till the younger generation has enough equity, as the example I gave you. Other examples that I've seen is where people might become an employee of the existing business while they start a new business, because that's going to be the future. So an example is one farm that I'm assisting another service provider on was a dairy farm that then became a heifer raising operation. And so they produced a lot of crops, and the son and daughter-in-law said, that's not what we want to do long term. But they're working in the heifer raising operation while they've been building together a grain operation and a flour operation. And so the goal ultimately is, when the parents are ready to retire, is to also retire the heifer raising business. But in the meanwhile, the son is helping keeping that going, is getting employment income that helps him not have to worry about the profitability of the brand new grain business. And so that's giving him some time to build up something that ultimately will become the main business. And sometimes people sell or retire their existing business entirely and someone new comes in to start a whole brand new business, brand new type of business, and particularly farmers without successors, this might be a common scenario, as much as, you know, we like if there's a good viable turnkey business to help that continue to that new successor. Sometimes it just makes sense, whether it's family or non-family, for somebody to just come in and do something entirely different that the older generation may have nothing to deal with. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, somebody was asking, can you discuss some considerations or issues related to farm valuation?
Sure. So there's a couple elements to that. So when people talk for farm valuation, for the most part, we're really talking about the value of the physical assets. It is very rare for the business to have what's called goodwill value or ongoing concern that is above the value of the physical assets. And that's because if you do if you do a typical business valuation, that's often done by a CPA, or there's, you know, some consultants that specialize in business valuation, so you can hire people in for those aspects. When they do evaluation, they look at for the farm to have that additional value, there has to be some sort of true brand identity for one aspect, where there's some brand loyalty, and that's, most farms don't have that. The examples where I've seen that has usually been when there's a value-added product, like a farmstead cheese making operation, where there's a clear, distinct cheese or distinct yogurt that people, know that brand name. But then there also has to be a sufficient profitability there, so that the farm would have to be able to be profitable above a manager's salary. So let's say you had to hire somebody to do what you're doing as the exiting farmer, and they'd have to pay you $70,000 or $80,000 a year. Or if it's a couple that's actually been working for like 50,000, now you got to hire two people to do the same work for 70 or 80,000 each. And then there has to be profit on top of that. And most farms are just not that profitable. So we don't tend to see any value beyond beyond the physical assets. Now, I've seen people try to value like a CSA list, but CSA lists, CSA turnover is generally like 60%, where it's 60 every year. You have to get a new 60% of your customers leave, and you have to get new customers, and you can't guarantee customers. And so even if you're have some value there, one of the issues that comes up is that most lenders don't want to deal with that additional value because there's no collateral there. You can't provide customers as collateral. So if there's going to be a sale of business value beyond the physical asset value, then it's usually a seller finance deal, where you're agreeing that you're going to take the risk that there's no collateral you're going to be able to collect on it. But for a farm name or something like that, if you do come to some agreement on what that value is, which usually gets to be, if people manage to negotiate that, it usually becomes much less than people thought it was going to be initially. And sometimes that's still more than what a person doing the business valuation would say it's valued at. But then it ends up being that seller financing. And so I see it on occasion, but not often. And again, you would get a CPA or there's some other consultants. There's a consultant here in Vermont, Rose Wilson, who does business valuations with people. So it has to be, very special circumstances. Otherwise, if you're looking at the intermediate assets, cattle and equipment, we'll go through very often the balance sheet becomes very important. What's the balance sheet for the farm? And looking at what's the value of those physical assets. We very often, people might have it for their insurance company or their lender, but they don't have a good equipment list, and we'll have people go through and put real values on it. What would it be if you have to have an auction tomorrow? What is going to be the value of that cattle and that equipment? And not inflating it, because I've seen farmers try to inflate it because they think they're pulling something on their lender as far as like, I got more collateral than, I made this tool that's only worth $1,000. I've said it's worth $5,000 on my balance sheet. Well, they see right through that anyway. And for the successor farmers, they're going to see through that too. They don't want to be buying into something that's inflated in value. But sometimes you may bring in an appraiser for that. You may bring in, we've used farm credit. We've used auctioneers to appraise equipment and cattle dealers to appraise cattle, and to get an unbiased third party view of that. And then on the other side, if you're creating an LLC and you're putting your cattle equipment, greenhouses, whatever you're putting in there into that business, you start with a balance sheet that's going to show both what are the value of those assets, but then what's the debt on the other side. And so the value of the shares in the LLC becomes that farm net worth. What is the value of the assets minus the liabilities, minus the debts? And that's the net worth of the business. And then you divide that net worth according to the percent ownership that people would have in there. And that's the value of their shares. Real estate can be a lot more straightforward. Real estate appraisers are out there. There's some that are more specialized. I actually see here on the webinar today, a farmer and appraiser. Rich Larson is out there, and Cynthia Larson. They're farm appraisers here in Vermont, and also farmers. And we bring them in frequently for farm appraisals on the real estate. So hopefully that answers the question. And
there's a slightly related question, Mike, that I think you did touch on this a bit, but with the housing market so high, how do you value the land for farming versus development?
I'm gonna hold off on that for a minute. I'm gonna come back to the real estate in a little bit more detail. So is there any other questions?
There's no other questions. There's a recommendation for somebody to do farm valuations, Rosalie Wilson, and there's a link in the chat for her website.
Yes. I don't know if I actually mentioned her name a moment ago, but that's the person here in Vermont, Rose Wilson, who has been doing business valuations. I actually just set her up with a business that I thought probably had some additional business value, and she's going to go through and hopefully in the next month or so give us a number to see if something is there. She has also done business valuations and shown that there is no actual value beyond the asset value. So, but Rose is great. She and I work together a lot. Great person. So Rose Wilson in Norwich, Vermont. With farmers without successors, and at this point you've been staring at these words for a while. Hopefully you've read through some of them, but you can recruit successors. We're doing that all the time. That's a big part of what Land for Good tries to do. Callie can put in the chat the link for New England Farm Finder, which I mentioned down at the bottom. Vermont, Maine, and Connecticut also have their own linking program, and so we'll often advertise or encourage the farmers, I should say, to advertise through those linking programs to making their farms available, including if they're looking to make them available to potential successors who might become partners with them in the intermediate step. And I've actually been working with a couple of farmers this winter on getting an advertisement out there for their opportunity to bring on people that they want to view as partners. I encourage people that if you're going to bring on somebody who you want to be a successor, to usually have them be an employee for a year, maybe 2, not any longer, as a trial period. Many of the best people that you're going to want to come on as a successor to your business are people who have a lot of skills and a lot of capabilities, who could potentially go out and start something on their own, and who may have already been through one of these situations before. where somebody promised them they'd come on as an employee, and then after a vague trial period, we'll decide if you become a partner, and then things fall apart. And they don't want to come into a vague situation again. And the people with the best business savvy skills, even if they've not been through that situation before, the kind of people you really want to take over your business because they're pretty business savvy, are going to ask you a lot of questions about the long-term trajectory. They're not going to want to get into a situation where they could be an employee for 5 years and then it doesn't work out because there was never a concrete plan or never a concrete commitment to actually moving to that next step. They don't want to waste that part of their lives. They want to be able to know that, yeah, maybe a year, maybe 2 years we're going to take to figure out if this is right for both of us. But after that, we got to move things forward. And so, sometimes the person might actually already be an employee. The example I keep coming back to, Phil, at the very, whose picture was at the very beginning. He was an employee since he was 15 years old and was 25 and worked at the farm for 10 years. We had actually interviewed 2 other employees on the farm. This came after it was very clear that the 2 children, the son and the daughter, had left the farm. We did explore whether they were considering to come back. Nope, very happy careers in New York and elsewhere, not interested in coming back. So we started interviewing employees that had been with them for a while, who they thought had the capabilities. And 2 others were interviewed in that discussion. And we had multiple meetings actually with them. And they ended up, one of them said, I want to go and farm my own farm. I don't want to be in this business. I got a different idea of what I want to do. Ironically, he's still there. And then the other person was like, no, I just want to be an employee. I want to be able to clock in, clock out. I want to get my paycheck. I don't want that kind of responsibility. And Phil was the one who stepped up and who wanted to become, explore becoming the partner. Another example was where a farm I worked with, where the business had grown. The farmer's son did not want to run the business by himself, and they started to recruit partners, including there was a grower who was growing on a smaller scale, who was in the area. It had very much impressed the senior farmer in terms of his management skills and how he approached his business. And how he approached his fields. They drove by each other's fields, so he saw how he managed the fields, and he said, I'd like to invite you to become a partner in this business. And he actually, it was a farmer I had worked with on a business plan years either, and he called me right up and says, I don't know, should I give up my business for this? And we talked about it for a long time, and now he is a partner in it. You can, there are a lot of examples where you can incorporate them into your existing business, or creating a new business, like we talked about earlier, where there might be a new enterprise that you're going to help grow together with them, or you might just lease the land to them, or sell the land if they're in a position to be able to buy you out. Or it might be a transition. A very common scenario is they're going to lease from you for a period of time, and then they're going to, and then after they've built up some equity, then you could sell them the farm. So I worked with an organic dairy in New Hampshire, had no children, no employees that they wanted to take over. And so we started advertising through New England Farm Finder, and we started to get some good hits. But I actually met the successor farmer at a pasture walk at the Byler Farm in Randolph, Vermont. And I introduced myself, and we got talking, and I found out he was looking for getting himself set up in an organic dairy. And so I think I got the right farm for you. And I was able to share with him what we advertised. And then we started doing some meetings, and it was a good fit. He actually came to work for them for 6 months, and then ended up buying the cattle and equipment from them, and is leasing the farm now until he builds up enough equity in cattle and equipment to actually buy the real estate. The Vermont Land Trust and other land trusts in the region well, mainly the Vermont Land Trust, Maine Farmland Trust has done a little bit of this as well, have buy, protect, sell programs where they will buy the farm, then protect it and then sell it to a farmer. Or there's different variations on this. Through the Farmland Access Program, sometimes they'll just work with a farmer who will be willing to not put it on the market until the conservation comes in. And meanwhile, the farmer may lease the farm until the easement is in place, and the land trust helps facilitate that. So there are different organizations that might be able to help with different ways of facilitating the land transfer. And when it comes to the real estate transfer, it's typically the last thing. It could be through the estate plan if it's family. In the interim, we'll often have a lease in place that's bearing on heirs, assigns, agents, and so forth, successors, so that even there's often a concern, and I was actually last night just meeting a farm where this was a concern, that wills can be changed, estate trusts can be changed, estate plans can be changed, and so that added protection would be a 99-year lease to the successor farmer that's going to be bearing on heirs and assigns. And so even if the will was changed, the whoever inherited it was going to inherit the tenant as well. And there's other tools like that we could get into more probably next week in the legal side of it. Sometimes there's gifting is involved, either partial gifting of equity, doing a bargain sale, and there's some not tax issues so much, but you need to just make sure you document the gift properly. We'll talk more about that in 2 weeks. And some people gift the farm completely. And actually, the discussion we had last night was potentially moving the direction where the mother might be gifting the farm while she's still alive, and then holding either a life estate, or what's more common is a life lease now for her to stay in the home. It's becoming more common to use legal entities now, where you might put the real estate into another LLC separate from the farm business and do a gradual transfer over time. One farm I'm working with now, what we're discussing is actually 2 farms we're working with now, putting the land into an LLC and then freezing the parent's equity. Actually, one's a parent and one's a non-parent. Actually, it's a non-family transfer. Freezing the senior generation's equity, and then as the existing debt, that the mortgage that they have on the real estate is paid down, that equity goes to that younger generation. So they're going to build up basically through sweat equity, that as the mortgage gets paid down, that equity goes to them. And if the real estate value increases, that equity goes to them, and the senior generation's equity stays the same until they either inherit it, or what we're talking about actually in both cases, there will eventually be a buyout, or it could be a buyout of family heirs.
Mike, just a time check. We have about 15 minutes left.
Yep. And often the sales are the sale of the farm go through conservation easements, which gets to that question that was asked a little while ago. That's the most common tool to make to have farms sold at farm value, and the farms are appraised at their fair market value, and then they're appraised at their conserved value, at the value of what a farmer would pay for it. And the difference is the development rights, and then very often a land trust or a state entity will come in and in the right situation with the right soils, and it's not every farm, but many farms will qualify for state and federal funding to buy those development rights to bring the price down. And in some cases, they'll look for a bargain sale where they'll ask the senior generation to donate the development rights, and that donation does have tax benefits to the donation, but you're still making a donation, to be clear, but you're donating some of that value. And so that's the most common tool that we use, and most of them that are used in this part of the country are for perpetuity. So it's permanently conserved, And the issue that people have to just keep in mind is you're not going to be able to do this in future generations. Just keep selling the development rights. And there's been tools that Vermont and Massachusetts have put into place to also make sure that the conserved farm still doesn't appreciate to or try to make sure that they don't appreciate to estate values, because there's many people that would just love to buy a rural part of Massachusetts or Vermont or anywhere else and have a nice conserved farm, and they don't care it can't be developed because they're not going to develop it. And so we have seen estate buyers trying to come in and buy conserved farms, but Vermont and Massachusetts estates have taken a concerted effort to start changing the easement or adding to new easements, I should say, not changing old easements per se, but adding to new easements tools that will help make sure that doesn't happen. And those tools are being adopted or changed in different ways in other states as well. So we've seen some of that being done in New Hampshire and Maine, and definitely in the Hudson Valley in New York. And so the conservation easement has been the main tool. If people can afford to also do gifting, that's the other way that people can pass it along to somebody at below what's fair market value. But that gets back to this issue of your what do you need to get out of it? Is that the only thing that you have to retire on? How much debt is on there? Do you, if you sell that below market value, are you going to be underwater on your debt? That's not going to work. It's not going to happen. So if the debt's low enough and you're going to net enough for your retirement, or maybe you plan well otherwise for retirement and don't need much from the sale of the real estate, you might be able to just gift more of that equity. And that's something for people to think through. And I can certainly expand on that towards the answering the earlier questioner. Retirement housing is a big issue that comes up here. Where are people going to live? I just gave one example where the person is going to stay in, and that stay in their house if they gift it to their child. The child and their spouse built a house around the corner. It cost them a lot more than they expected, but not more than I expected. And I work a lot with people on this, trying to figure out this retirement house. Either it's housing for building a house or buying a house for people in retirement, especially if you want to give a discounted or gifted value to the farm. How are you going to, where are you going to live, and how are you going to afford that? Or if the junior generation is going to build a farm, can they afford build a house? Can they afford to build a house? And so if there's not already multiple houses on the property, and so we're constantly trying to work through that issue. And then, as we'll expand on next 2 weeks, the long-term health care and implications about having assets in your name, including the real estate and your private residence, gets to be part of that factor and consideration for public funding for long-term health care. So that gets often into the discussion about how the real estate is transferred. So with that, I want to just make sure that questioner that asked the earlier question about values had that, if that answered you sufficiently, or if you want any more thought or clarification on farm values, farm real estate value.
At this point, also feel free to unmute if you'd like to comment on that. So you can also still put questions in the chat, but feel free to unmute yourself.
Yep. And this is my last slide. I'll just mention real quick, and we can definitely then open up further for questions. But we, through the viability program here in Vermont, we provide a viability. We provide a transfer plan, and sometimes I in the past I usually didn't like writing up the plan, but I realized it's been really helpful for people over the years to have it documented. What did we talk about? What decisions were made? People often aren't keeping minutes at these family meetings. And what is the time frame? Because that is really critical to a lot of people. And what gets a lot of successors particularly anxious is if the timetable is vague, or there was a timetable that nobody wrote down and can't hold people accountable to exactly, but it's all of a sudden getting dragged out and things are not moving at the pace that people want to do. So sometimes having a written plan can be, with these SMART goals, can be helpful. With that, I want to definitely thank again our funders and then open it up fully to questions. We do have 10 minutes if people have any questions or comments for that matter, or suggestions on things. Appreciate people putting the rows in there and other suggestions. So I have lulled everybody to sleep. Oh, I think Carl wants to say something, but he's not muted. Carl, I love you. I knew you'd say something.
Well, I don't know if it's the appropriate moment, but for those of us who are stumbling along the beginning of this path, what would you advise in terms of our outreach to Land for Good for assistance here?
Yeah, so if you want the initial consultation and not sure that you want to sign up for the full, Farm and Forest Viability Program, just go to our website, and Callie can put in a link there where you can fill out our intake form, and then you'll get, if you're not in Vermont, you'll get sent, your intake form will get sent to the respective state, or Carl, yours will get sent to me. And then somebody from our organization will then follow up and schedule a 2 to 3 hour consultation, or a couple consultations over 2 to 3 hours. And then if it makes sense to continue, the discussion, then, in Vermont, we typically encourage people to sign up for the Farm and Forest Viability Program. And then in other states, we'll work with the programs that exist there or other funding sources that we have if people want to work longer term with us on those issues. Any other questions, comments?
We do also have a survey, if everyone wouldn't mind filling that out, brief evaluation to help us with future trainings. I put the link for that in the chat.
Yeah, the surveys are important to helping us improve what we're doing, as well as also show the funders that, that there's some value here to what we're doing. So please fill out the survey. Please plan on coming back next week for the legal discussion with Daphne Moritz, estate planning using business entities, and we might get into some other legal issues. And I hope you plan on joining us, for the last 2 sessions as well. If there's
I did have one more question.
Sure.
So I'm on the side of looking to acquire farm or business. And I've taken other seminars that talked about some of the processes that a farm seeker can follow, New England Farm Finder, etc. But we didn't really address how Land for Good or others tries to link up farm seekers and farm people looking to move out of their farm or retire, or whatever it is. Are we going to address that at some point during this webinar?
Well, I think most simply, that was what I was talking about back a couple of slides where we were talking about recruitment, land linking programs. We work with the farmers that are looking to transfer these farms and other property owners, other non-farmers, and we're trying to get them to list their properties on these land linking programs and the Farm Finder program, New England Farm Finder, so that people can find each other without always going through us. And so farmers that I'm working with, or that other of our staff are working with on succession plan, or other providers, for instance, NOFA or UVM extension, trying to get them, those farmers to post their offerings and their opportunities there so that people like you can find out about them, as well as trying to put that out there into the broader networks through, say, the Vermont Vegetable and Berry Growers Association, or through listservs, through advertising with different agricultural publications. We're trying to, I always encourage the farmer that's looking for a successor to cast as wide a net as possible, especially if it's a successor in a business where they're looking for a partner to come in. But even if it's just a real estate, cast as wide a net to think about where are the agricultural circles. And then when we work with seekers, we're trying to point them in the direction of where they might see the properties, particularly the farm finding. But otherwise, we do, I don't know if you've done any of our other programs at Land for Good, like Acquiring Your Farm, but that, that's more, this is not going to be as in detailed about, and especially not in the next number of sessions about searches.
Yeah, no, I did Acquiring Your Farm. But if you look at New England Farm Finder, I think I haven't been on there in a couple of weeks, but the number of farm seekers is in the thousands, and the farm, offers is not even close to that. So
Right.
it's a challenge. That's all.
Yeah, well, and certainly we provide 2 to 3 hour advisory sessions to farm seekers as well, and so I encourage you to potentially sign up for that. I think Acquiring Your Farm, was one of the goals. I don't particularly I don't teach that particular class, but I know the way we were setting it up was towards different search techniques, because Farm Finder is not the only way you're going to find it. We would love everybody to post there, but we know they're not. So we similarly give the seekers different tools that they might work with to search and find and network to network in farm communities.
Yep. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yep. Any last questions, comments? Well, thank you all for coming today, and look forward to having you come over the next 3 weeks. Have a good day.